Looks like we're live.
Good morning. Good morning. And welcome to CPUS and A. Michael, hey, how's it going, man?
Good morning. Happy V-Day.
Happy V-Day, V-Day. What is V-Day, Scott? Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Revolution.
Good morning,
V-Day
Revolution.
is VE Day, Victory Against Fascism in Europe Day, the day when the Allied forces liberated Europe from the fascist danger, the fascist.
And stopped 1,000 years of Hitler fascism. That was what they wanted, right, in the Third Reich. They thought that
1,000-year right.
they thought that they were going to have Aryan white supremacist fascist rule, but the Red Army,
Get other ideas.
they did. That's where 3/4 of the German divisions were on the Russian front, and that's where they got their butt whoop, in combination with the Russian winter.
And we really have to honor the tremendous sacrifice that the Soviet people made to hold up the Nazi advance, to tie them up there, to defeat them. It cost 20 million Soviet lives for the liberation of Europe.
Have mercy. Have mercy.
I was watching the Battle of Russia actually last night on YouTube, or I'm sorry, on Netflix before I was falling asleep, and it's kind of about the Soviet effort in World War II, but it's made by American film directors. And it was just very powerful. And it talked about all the things that Hitler was planning to do with the Slavic and Russian peoples, this enslavement of them and this taking of their resources, and how they literally fought mile by mile by mile all the way to Moscow to hold them off, and eventually, pushed them back all the way back to Berlin. Very powerful story.
It's a tremendous story. Because fascism, Nazism, and genocide against gypsies, against gay people, against the disabled, and you can imagine if the Jewish people, 6 million died in Auschwitz and Buchenwald and the other concentration camps. You can imagine what they were going to do to people of color. It was just a terrible, horrendous, barbaric.
Hitler's plans were inspired to some degree by, I've read, by white supremacist theories and practices coming out of the United States, right?
By Jefferson Davis. And there was a doctor during, I forget, the 19th century, who they had all this kind of pseudoscience, because they had to say that Black people were subhuman, as an effort to justify slavery. Michael said we were subhuman, and there was this doctor, I believe his name was Samuel Cartwright, who came up with all these different funny diseases. So if you ran away from slavery, you were afflicted with running away-itis or something.
And the way Hitler adopted that, the way Hitler may have adopted some of that, ideology and theories and such, it may reflect on, I believe it's probably more than a rumor, the fact that Trump had Mein Kampf sitting on his bedside years ago. That's what his ex-wife says, and so that's what the second defeat of the rise of fascism, I would say, is going to look like. It starts with defeating Trump and Bolsonaro and Netanyahu and all these other reactionary governments around the world.
Of course, it's not a crime to read Mein Kampf. It's a crime to implement the politics and the procedures and the policies of Mein Kampf. And that is, Scott, what is happening when you encourage armed gangs in Michigan and in Virginia and to go to the state capitol and threaten
and
democracy.
enter the premises of the state capitol while the legislature is in session carrying assault weapons and walk away with nothing, scot-free, no consequences.
Where's the outcry?
And
Where are
where
the
is the
public?
response? Yeah, where's the we've been hearing respectable people on both sides of the aisle talk in bourgeois journal media about the need to defend the institutions of the republic and defend democracy. So defend it. I mean, what's happening?
Oh, it's just the good old boys, they're harmless, they don't mean it, they just like to go off in the woods and shoot, they're releasing tension, they're tense,
Yeah.
man. They need to get it off their chest. But
It's like
they're sitting on our backs and they're threatening to break democracy. That's what's going to happen unless this stuff is reversed.
and if you think that this isn't having an effect on people who will or will not turn out to vote in November, then even already in 2018, somebody I talked to knocking on doors was terrified to go to the polls because she was afraid that there'd be intimidation and like confrontation, and she just didn't want to deal with it. So we have really got to fight for the blocking any kind of intimidation, armed menace, and also working for vote by mail, for absentee voting. It's a major problem.
I think
I
the
read
only
an
real
article.
response I've seen, the best response I guess I've seen, is from our party in terms of what it's written on its website, and the PW as well, regarding this fascist danger in the recent days in terms of these armed gangs showing up at Capitol building. But what was really powerful to me was, I believe it was yesterday or the day before, I saw a video of an African American state, congressperson walking into the Michigan State Capitol with bodyguards, with armed bodyguards, in light of what was happening. That's the response now, because what are you going to do, if I'm assuming she's a Democratic congresswoman, at the state level. So, but that's what point we're at.
She's an African American woman representative in Lansing. I saw that. That's one level, but in order to stop it, the people have to stop. Trade unions have to stop it. Churches have to stop it. There has to be a mass outpouring of public reaction to it. That's what's going to. It has to be isolated. The public has to isolate these forces. That's what happened in South Africa. They were able to isolate these fascist, racist, apartheid people, and then disarm them.
I think we should take care to point out here that when we talk about isolating and disarming the extreme right, we're not talking about like Trump voters as a blanket category. We're not talking about my neighbor with the Trump sign. We're talking about this relatively small body of, first of all, extreme reactionary forces in the ruling class, and backed up by this extreme right-wing militia movement of a sort of neo-Confederate character, some people say. So that's what we're talking about. We're not saying that Trump voters there's a section of Trump voters who come from the working class who have to be won back to the struggle for democracy, which is in the interest of all working people. But that other force, the ruling class section, it has to be crushed. It has to be dismantled entirely.
I think a lot of this anger too that the people are showing, in reaction to not just these armed gangs and Trump's nonsense and lack of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the recent killing of Ahmaud Arbery by two police officers, father and son, and how I believe now something's been done about it. I believe they've been taken into custody or something. I believe
they've been charged with murder.
Yeah, but just that big gap of time, it's really upsetting that our communities, especially our communities of color, or working communities of color, have to live in fear. And I think we're really going to see an uptick. We already did in the primaries of African American voters, but I think it's going to be even more huge, just a huge turnout in November.
It needs to be all voters. It needs to be Latino voters, Asian voters, and it needs to be white voters, and it needs to be some of those voters who voted for Trump. They have to realize what they're supporting, who they're supporting, and the consequences of casting a ballot, you know, for the ugliest, most vicious administration in the history of the republic, you know, and then, you know, the question, and it's not just in the White House, it's also in the Senate and in the House of Representatives and in state bodies all over the country.
And it's
They
also
gotta go, Scott.
Cultural institutions and civil society. There's this. So I guess, you know, the phrase "decisive defeat of the extreme right," decisive defeat of reaction, it gets used sometimes in a way that's sort of vague. Lenin, when he coined it, had a very specific thing in mind, which was the power of, at that time, the Tsarist autocracy had to be broken to such an extent that the other section of the ruling class, the liberal bourgeoisie, could no longer be drawn into compromises with the far right. And to my mind, a defeat of that level for the extreme right, it means, of course, getting rid of Trump, of course, retaking the Senate and a bunch of state houses, but also, you know, breaking the power of organizations like the NRA, of right-wing media monopolies like Sinclair, of you know, enforcing the tax exempt laws that are supposed to prohibit churches from electioneering from the pulpit, but, you know, are not working. The whole apparatus that's driving the growth of the fascist threat needs to be dismantled.
But also their social base has to be, you know, I mean, and the social base is in the big banks, number one. That's where they're getting most of their support, you know, but also the sources that are driving middle class people towards fascist ideas and a section of working class to fascist ideas, that has to be addressed too.
Yes.
You know, so you need radical reforms, you know, that are going to push the sources of that hatred out the door. That's what it has to be pushed out the door. And
we need a program that will unite all of the forces who have an interest in the defeat of the fascist threat, but under the leadership of the most democratic, most progressive working class forces.
Michael, it seems to me like you also got to deal with the state security, FBI, intelligence, the police. There has to be a radical reform of the police.
Totally. The way that institution of police is set up right now is it's not just, you know, a servant of the state. It is inherently racist. We just celebrated the Haymarket martyrs a few days ago on May Day, right? That's an example of how long in our history the institution as it exists under capitalism has been oppressive towards, you know, working people, people of color, and so on. But, you know, I was thinking of the Carnation Revolution in Portugal. This was, again, something we celebrated the anniversary of just a few days ago at the end of April. And when they had their democratic revolution in 1975, their institution of police changed. It's not that police officers don't exist. They do not exist as they did before the democratic revolution. In fact, they're all members of the Communist Party in Portugal, and they're all unionized. Yeah, so that's
Portugal. You had a dictatorship, right?
Yes,
and
Salazar.
And then there was a democratic uprising. I think the army was involved in it, you know, and the working class, and they overthrew it, and they established a democratic republic, and they call it the Carnation
The
Revolution.
because it was not violent. They put carnations in the muskets of their guns, and they did not shoot. It was a peaceful transition.
Wonderful. So these are some of the things that have to happen in order, Scott, to decisively. And the question is, can you do that with the two-party system? Can you do it with the Republican Party now is the most reactionary, dangerous, tilting towards fascism party in the planet, armed with nuclear, biological weapons, armed with poisonous broadcasting like Fox News. And so it seems to me that you got to think about, a radical reform of the political system as well. So, is it possible under capitalism to decisively defeat the extreme right? Now in South Africa, they did. And in Portugal, they did. But can it be done, Scott, in the United States?
Can it be done in the heart of capitalist and imperialist reaction? I think what we can say is that the democratic revolution is going to continue until we have built socialism. Not even just until the socialist revolution, but until the overthrow of capitalism and the construction of a real socialist society. That's when democracy is achieved.
Now, I read a really interesting article the other day. It was written by a cat named Max Elbaum. He put forward, he's a Marxist kind of guy, more than kind of guy. He's out in the Bay Area. Max was arguing that the next stage in the struggle for democracy in the United States is the fight for what he called a multiracial democracy. Multiracial democracy. He said that given the centrality of racism in the United States and the growing multiracial character of the country and the Trump administration's use of racism as an organizing principle, that the way to argue this issue now is to build a democracy of all the people. I thought that was an interesting concept as the next stage in the fight to defeat Trump, that we're trying to bring the country together.
That's interesting.
Very interesting concept.
I think it's a good starting.
Sorry, Michael, go for it.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's a really good starting point. Because we have to look for unity where possible. We may not agree on everything. I would say the vast majority of Americans probably don't want a socialist revolution tomorrow. We know that's not possible, but we can definitely agree on things such as healthcare. I don't think anybody would say I want to live in a world without healthcare. I think most Americans would want to live in a world without misogyny and racism. I think I could safely, assume that. But I think it's going to take, like I said, a massive turnout, not only in the voting polls, but even after. This goes beyond the elections. I think to keep the ultra right, the extreme right out of power, we're going to eventually have to look at the, electoral college and at the one person, one vote, because imagine what our government would look like. It would still be capitalist. It would still have its issues. But imagine how many Republican presidents wouldn't have been president if had we not had the electoral college, or wouldn't have been Nixon, Bush, Trump. So I think that's another thing we have to look at, going forward.
We cannot end today without talking about the unemployment crisis. It is officially 14.1%, 8, something like that. Unofficially,
much.
Huh?
14.2 damn much percent. 3.2 million people filed for benefits last week.
And it's going to be double that in the Black and brown communities, because they don't count people who have supposedly given up looking for work. I come from Youngstown, Ohio. I don't know nobody that
nobody's given up looking for work.
Nobody. That's a lot of bunch of that's bourgeois nonsense. That people who don't know anybody who's poor and desperate for working, and so the crisis is so huge now, but the response to it is so meager. You know, it doesn't meet the need, and it's not going to meet the need unless we get organized.
And we have to, I think we have to be very clear that unemployment is something that is caused by capitalism. It is caused in the service of the profits of the capitalist class. And unemployed people are workers who have a right to housing, to pay at their full wages while they're unemployed, to food and to medical care. These are not negotiable. Your dignity and your safety as a human being should not depend on how much money you're generating for capital at any given moment.
People are hungry, man. You got long lines of car, a mile, 2 miles long, you know, soup kitchens. And Lindsey Graham has the audacity to say, we'll extend unemployment over my dead body. Capitalism is dying, Lindsey Graham, you know, and the people are going to rise up and they're going to put your corrupt system, you know, up under the ground, and a new humane, collective, caring, sustainable society is going to be born. You just watch Lindsey Graham and Trump.
One of my favorite lines. One of my favorite lines from the manifesto, one of the most powerful lines, is I think at the end of chapter 1, maybe bourgeois and proletarians. Yeah, where Marx writes, this capitalist class is no longer fit to rule over society. Its existence is no longer compatible with ours. They've got to go.
Got to go. You got the last word. Good morning, revolution, y'all. See you next week. Power to the working class and people, Michael. Power.
Power to the people.
Power. Power. Say it again. I can't hear you. Power.
Power.
Say it like you mean it. Power. Bye, y'all.
Bye.